The issues affecting you. Revealed, explained, discussed. Now on WGAL 8 In Focus.
Hello, I'm Susan Shapiro. More than 60 years after the assassination, people are still talking and debating about how President John F. Kennedy was killed. That includes independent filmmaker Mary Haverstick. The Lancaster woman started a film project about an aviation pioneer, and it turned into a deep dive in mystery, hidden identities, and a new take on the assassination. Tonight, we're putting her book, A Woman I Know, in focus. Joining us now is author and filmmaker Mary Haverstick of Lancaster. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, it's like old times, Susan, to come back to Channel 8 and be in this very room.
I must say, or some of our viewers might not remember, but you worked here for a time.
I did work here for 3 years in the second half of the 80s, if I can say the dates, but it was a wonderful period of my life hosting Susquehanna People.
And since then, you've been a filmmaker, making a lot of different films and getting a lot of attention for them. What is it about storytelling that you like?
Well, I think it's interesting. Going from Channel 8, where we did things that were urgently needed to get to the public right away, I became very interested in telling longer stories, right? Because films can go into things where you research and work on a project for, a matter of years, often maybe 3 years for a feature film or a documentary. But this book that I just did wound up being a 12-year-long project, Susan, so I think I've just stretched that timeline out, right? Continually just taking on bigger and bigger chunks of the pie to tackle.
That's amazing, that long a time.
Crazy.
Congratulations on the book, by the way. It is quite the tome and really well-researched. This came about because someone gave you another book so many years ago. Tell me about that.
Well, I was going for a film idea. A woman, an elderly woman and her daughter gave me the book about the Mercury 13. And they were a group of really interesting women at NASA, in the early days of NASA, when only men were astronauts. We remember that, the Mercury, the Apollo programs. And these women were pilots that had passed the test to become an astronaut. And then they were fighting for their rights. Of course, the world wasn't ready at the time, and America wasn't ready for female astronauts. That didn't come till Sally Ride. But this group of 13 women, called the Mercury 13, tried and failed, but paved the way for everybody else to follow.
Why didn't they ever go to space?
Well, I think I hate to say it, but there was quite a bit of sexism back then. John Glenn wasn't even a fan of the women going. There was a feeling that women just weren't ready to do certain things in 1961 and 2. We were just getting to the idea of women's lib and women having certain kinds of jobs and professions. So I think they were really held back by their times.
Now, you, at least from my perspective, you allude that the Mercury 13 might have sort of been a cover for some of these women who...
Well, I don't know about the other women. I don't want to speak too much about the women who I haven't studied as closely, but I went after, for an idea for a film, the leader of the Mercury 13 was a woman named Jerry Cobb. And she had really fought for her rights and led the program, was the first one to pass the astronaut tests. And I sought her out as an older woman, and I wanted to tell her story in a movie. And it was really going to be like a big deal. It was going to be my biggest film to date, with potentially movie stars and a good budget. But it was also my first time telling a big, kind of historic American story. So I got a hold of her and interviewed her directly. And we were in the process of doing a movie when I had a tremendous interruption, shall we say.
How did you get a hold of her? A lot of other people couldn't get a hold of her. Certainly her name was out there and people knew of her.
They did, and I think she did go back and forth with some folks in emails occasionally. She claimed that she was still in the Amazon jungle where she was doing charity work when I approached her. That was her story. I'm not sure I believe it now. But yeah, she did answer. I really think there was something good or bad about me that she resonated to, because we eventually met at an airport to talk about the idea. And we had a lunch. And at the end of the lunch, she was on board to do the movie. So I just think it was a matter of two people, or her timing was right to accept me as the person who would tell her story.
Well, who wouldn't want you to tell their story,
thank you, Susan.
But she was from Oklahoma and became an aviator.
She was a tremendous aviator, and I think that's not in question. She was amazing, ahead of her time. She'd had more hours than John Glenn, for example. She wasn't allowed, of course, to do the military flying in the jets that the men had done, but she'd flown almost every other kind of craft, and she'd flown in dangerous, treacherous areas, and was really adept at short dangerous landings, like short landings on beaches and, you know, those kind of quick ins and outs. That was her specialty.
How did she learn aviation?
Well, the story is that she learned from her father in Oklahoma and that he was a military man. But again, as I got to know more about this whole thing, I started to not believe everything that I was being told.
All right, well, we're going to talk more about what to believe and what not to believe, and also another Cobb named June Cobb when we come back.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus, coverage you can count on.
We continue our conversation with author and filmmaker Mary Haverstick, who's recently published a book called A Woman I Know. Great title there about this woman. You spent so much time with Jerrie Cobb. I mean, years of time, and you traveled with her. How did that come about?
Well, initially I was working with her to tell the story on film, so it would have been a lot like Hidden Figures, if people remember that movie, quite a hit. But this would have told that story of the women who were trying to be astronauts when they couldn't. And we were doing formal interviews, much like we're sitting here. It would be formal, and I had my notepad. But this whole process of formally interviewing her for the film got interrupted because I was visited at the time when I was trying to make that movie by a woman from the Department of Defense who was, I thought she became a friend of mine, and she was a practitioner of espionage for our country. And it was a fascinating new friend that I had for a few weeks in my life. But the friendship kind of soured a bit when she started to give me what certainly sounded to me like warnings that something was wrong with this film. And she literally came to my office in downtown Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and pointed to my documents about Jerrie, things Jerrie had given me about her life, you know, folders that I had. And she said that those documents in particular were classified and needed to be in a vault.
Wow.
That's about when our friendship hit the skids, and I felt that maybe she was there for a reason such as a warning. So I started to look into what was wrong with the story. And when I did a little more deeper dive that Jerrie could the woman I know have anything to do with espionage, became a question that I had. And I found a doppelganger, a woman named June Cobb, whose life, Susan, within 2 hours of Googling this June Cobb and knowing Jerrie's story, I knew there was so much overlap between the two women that it was almost astronomically impossible for them.
They were both born in Oklahoma and were both aviators,
both
right?
had traveled to the Amazon jungle in the 1950s when almost no people from North America had been down there, okay? But both of them are named Cobb. They're in this jungle. They're young, blonde. They're girls or college-age gals that are, you know, what parent is going to allow their daughter to go down? At the time, there were rumors of cannibals, and it was extremely dangerous. Yet they're both in aviation. I mean, the similarities went on and on and on. And I went to confront Jerrie about who is this June Cobb, and, you know, how could she be so astronomically similar to you? So I had to have that wonderful talk with her. Which was the craziest conversation I've ever been in, and Jerrie's answers were not very good. The most surprising thing being that she wasn't very upset at me asking that question, right? If I say, "You're not Susan Shapiro," I think you'd be a little upset.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
She wasn't mad at all. She was like, "Oh, very coy." So I knew right away that I was on a very different landscape with this woman, that all was not as it seemed, and apparently I'd stepped into the world of espionage, and I'd stepped into a world that I knew nothing about.
I was going to say, how much of espionage did you know about?
Nothing. Channel 8 didn't prepare me, filmmaking didn't prepare me, I really didn't know anything about it. It is a fascinating world, and I did start to study it, because what I did is I started to go, okay, if the woman I know, as Jerrie, has something to do with June Cobb, who is a spy. June Cobb was a spy in the National Archives. There were thousands of documents about her spying career, and they pertain to the Kennedy assassination. That's the documents that June Cobb's story of spying is told in. So I had to study up and learn about the Cold War, about espionage, about spying. It really took and I stopped the movie. I was not going to make a movie about the astronaut story, which I felt now was not either the whole truth or maybe I don't know how much of it's true, but certainly there was an untruth in there, and I didn't want to be responsible for doing that story.
Do you think June and Jerry were the same person, or that they were masquerading as one another?
So the end game, and I'm really fast forwarding through it. It took me a long time to get here, and I go through all that in the book, but I came to a conclusion that in espionage, Susan, names can be borrowed. So I could borrow, this is in the Cold War before the internet, but I could borrow the name Susan Shapiro if you agreed and our government supported us, and I could go to Cuba and do things and come back. And if we were both on board with that, and if we looked similar, you might be able to pull that off. And I think these structures of name borrowing, I mean, in the Kennedy documents, in June Cobb's spy dossier, it's just outright spelled out that she loaned her birth certificate and her name to another woman. That is spelled out in the documents. So it's very, very clear that back in the Cold War, identity swapping, borrowing, and cloaking who you are was an everyday occurrence in espionage.
You said pseudonyms, code names, all kinds of things
that's
were
how
going
they
on.
rolled. Yep.
All right, well, stay with us, Mary. We'll talk more about the JFK assassination and how your character of your book fits into that.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus, coverage you can count on.
And we continue our conversation with author and filmmaker Mary Haverstick of Lancaster. Again, thanks for being here. You talk about Jerry Cobb in this book and her connection to the JFK assassination and the fact that she was in Dallas at that time, at least from your research, that's what you found.
Well, she told me that herself, right when I confronted her, because keep in mind, I was working with her to create the film about her life. And when I found there was something wrong with that story, obviously I went to the horse's mouth. I had a talk with her, sat across this close to her, and I confronted her and said, how could you have these wild similarities to June Cobb? And, you know, she kind of hedged and said, well, she believed that June impersonated her for a while, was one of the things she said. But then she also said, because I was pressing her about June's piloting and involvement, you know, in the Kennedy saga. And Jerry outright told me that in this conversation that she was in Dallas on the day that Kennedy died, and she was flying a flight out of Dallas on that day after the assassination. She told me a tremendous amount of detail about that story. That story was very troubling to me, frankly, because I already knew the story of that plane. And I already knew a lot of people were worried about what that plane was doing, since it was leaving in such a hurry right after the assassination.
From an airport, Redbird.
Redbird,
that is
a Dallas airport for
airport,
private
yeah.
planes. And people had called it into TV stations and radio stations. The public was concerned about that plane. And so Jerry was now placing herself in a plane of concern. So that gave me a sense of urgency that if this woman has a double identity and she's telling me that she's in Dallas flying that plane, that put me on a quest to learn a whole lot more about the Kennedy assassination and what could be hidden in this dichotomy of June and Jerry Cobb.
So what do you think her connection was to the JFK assassination?
I became very concerned about, it ultimately comes down to, was the woman I'm dealing with a good guy or a bad guy? Right? Because a lot of spies can be doing cool things for our country and protecting us, but
they can be double agents too, right?
They can be double agents, and there were some things in the Cold War that weren't so up and up, right? I think we've all read about some of the Cold War tactics. So things were a bit different back then. I came across, as I looked into June Cobb and what the CIA agent June Cobb was doing, I came on a very troubling story where June Cobb was basically harassing a witness down in Mexico who had seen Lee Harvey Oswald. And when you look closely at what June Cobb was doing, she appeared to be running interference so that that witness who had information for our government and for the FBI would not tell what she knew to the investigations. And the way that June Cobb was running interference, you know, gave me a lot of concern about who June Cobb was and what she was up to.
And a scar played. Well, back to the JFK assassination. You also look at a person who was on scene called the Babushka woman, a woman who's in at least one photo, if not more.
Oh, a lot of photos,
on
yeah.
the scene there with something in her hands.
So, honestly, Susan, people who have looked, including the Warren Commission and the Congress, and even many of the authors today, they haven't looked very closely at the women who were in the story of the JFK assassination. Keep in mind, this was looked into in the 60s and 70s initially, right? And people weren't thinking of women being pilots and women being astronauts. And the same thing that made me interested in Jerry was the very thing that made a spy who was a woman be an extremely concealed person, especially if she was up to no
She could hide in plain sight.
She could hide in plain sight. And I found a woman who really disturbed me, who was on Dealey Plaza, the Babushka woman. There's a woman who was really the closest, one of the very closest spectators when Kennedy was fatally wounded in the head, the final shot that killed him. And this woman was yards away. She's aiming a camera at him, and no one, and she walked away. She was a bit concealed in a headscarf. And Susan, she walked off Dealey Plaza and nobody found her. She, maybe 15, 20 years later, a woman claimed to be her. People were very skeptical. But basically, she walked into history and is considered one of the biggest mysteries of all time.
And do you think that's Jerry Cobb?
I wondered if, you know, the frame, the size, I mean, I certainly put it out there that, well, she could have made it to the Redbird Airport in time. So I did ultimately have, I cannot sit here and say I've solved anything about the assassination, nor do I claim to. But I do think that I've brought to the forefront some things that have not ever been looked into. June Cobb, the Babushka, Jerry's flying a flight away. I think these, in the days when the Congress is looking at this once again anew, I feel that I've brought some new information to the table, and I'm very proud of having done that.
Yeah, it's, as I say, quite the heavily researched book, that's for sure. Who do you think wanted JFK killed?
My sense of it after studying it, and again, I have to preface, I'm Mary Haverstick from Lancaster County. I'm not a Harvard historian, but I've spent a lot of time looking at it. I felt there were problems with the official Warren Commission story, which 80%, I think, of Americans didn't believe at the time, and I think it's still over half of Americans don't believe the official story. I'm in that half that has some problems with the official story for sure. And as I studied it, I became extremely concerned about a small group of kind of problematic folks in the CIA who were mounting some assassination efforts against Castro and some others. Those were authorized. But once
an assassination program, right?
They had a little program,
yeah.
And they were trying to get, you know, we all know we were trying to get Castro. Lumumba was another one. But once that group had, and they were super secret, had that capability, I worry about that capability, Susan. Today, we know if we go after Osama bin Laden. But back then, there was a cloak and dagger over all this stuff. And I think when things are that concealed, a lot of bad things can happen.
All right. Well, we'll talk about some more bad things and some of your research and how that went.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus. Coverage you can count on.
Mary Haverstick is here. She's a filmmaker and the author of A Woman I Know. She's from Lancaster. Thanks again for being here. This took a tremendous amount of research. You traveled to different places. You went to the National Archives. You read documents and documents. What was that like for you?
It was a real departure from filmmaking where, much like what you do and what we both enjoy doing, where you sit and talk to somebody and you get their story. And that's how I was used to doing things, and I've always loved doing that. I had to go into the libraries and kind of crack the books, and I had to read what other authors had written about the Cold War. So, you know, I guess it's good to stretch yourself, Susan, to get into something new. And so I took it in that spirit. It was not easy. It was tough work, and it was a lot of sitting in cold rooms with documents. But I did. I learned a lot, and I think that I can bring that ethos back into my filmmaking now. You know, I think that it stretched me as a person, and I'm glad I did it.
And we've talked a lot, the JFK assassination. Many more documents are currently being released, so it's still in the news this many decades later.
Well, it's very much in the news. I think there's been a clamoring over the decades for more to come out. Why not? I mean, I think people were pretty upset that the CIA and the FBI had not really released all the documents. And they still were redacting quite a bit. Quite a bit about June Cobb, by the way, was still concealed. Why? At 60 years later, when anybody who's involved in those days was at the, you know, at best 90-something, but there was nothing left to hide. It couldn't be national security anymore. And so I think it's a bipartisan issue where people can agree on transparency, and I think it's a good thing that our Congress has started to do, you know, roll out some of these hearings, and they are bringing forward more documents.
You spent so much time with this woman. Did any of this time ever sort of frighten you? And one thing we didn't touch on that I wanted to bring up was this scar that was really telling. Tell me about that.
Well, there were a few things that made me sure that I was on the right track, right? You don't want to go on a goose chase and you've come out with a crazy story, a crazy book. And ultimately, I found June Cobb had a scar, and another name I believe she used, another woman's name that was a spy, also had a scar, who was scarred by Fidel Castro's thugs who'd gotten her and scarred a 2 into her left arm. And I was one time out with Jerry when she was wearing a T-shirt, and I just couldn't believe it when I looked down and there was the giant shape of a 2, which I was able to also photograph because it was important to document this, and another scar that she had on her collarbone, which was a scar that June Cobb had from an illness. So those scars, and an eyewitness that I witnessed who knew June as a CIA, in her CIA era, and identified a photo of Jerry. So I had a number of times where I was able to finally nail something down. But I think in this world, you never totally nail these things down because they're always built with a certain deniability. And I think that's by design.
Did any of this ever frighten you?
Yes, I mean, I might be a nervous Nellie to begin with. Right, but yes, absolutely. As soon as I realized that that a woman I'm dealing with had a double identity, who was she? I was probably scared right there. But when I really started to feel like it had something to do with secrets that were hidden in the Kennedy documents and the Kennedy assassination, I was scared. The more I got into it, I ultimately found that I have faith in our government and our country now. And I ultimately found that that faith brought me through, that I felt I was going to be safe to do this. And I'm sitting here, Susan, so I think I was safe to do it.
Well, we're so glad you've been sitting here. Thank you so much. It's really a fascinating read. There's a lot of detail in there, but it is terribly interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for WGAL 8 in Focus. For all of us at WGAL, I'm Susan Shapiro. And join us again next Saturday night at 7 o'clock for WGAL 8 in Focus, right after NBC Nightly News. And you can watch each episode of In Focus, plus WGAL's latest newscasts, original programming, and more. Just download the Very Local app and stream for free on Roku and Amazon Fire TV.